Mr. Speaker, the United States of America is a global empire built upon the subjugation of the black body. A nation built on a tradition of plunder, of slavery, and of exclusion. A tradition that continues to this day in a modern Jim Crow, where black people are locked up in prisons where they're systematically kept out of the halls of power and of the bastions of opportunity that we call things like education and healthcare. We're proud on opening government to stand for a people who've now withstood 450 years of victimization, marginalization, and exclusion. We say enough is enough. We'll give them a state. A three-part model from opening government. First, we're going to give them a resource-rich, well-located part of the United States, following on the tradition of reparation-based state giving, i.e. Israel. And just for the sake of it, we're going to give them Texas. Two. The second thing, we're going to fulfill the reparation part of our model by saying that the United States government, as it presently stands, will provide technical expertise, and in the first few years to get it off the ground, will provide the funding for the budget. The third thing is it will have the status of any other nation. That's to say you can have dual citizenship with the United States. We think that's okay, for instance. We think they'll be recognized by international organizations like the GA. We allow a free flow of remittances back into that nation. Two arguments then I'm going to present. First is on the principle of reparation. We say that, first of all, the most important thing when it comes to reparations for historical injustice is that it be directly proportionate. It is a requirement of the principle of fairness, that is to say justice, that when you have a violation of the principal equality of individuals, that what is involved is the restoration of that past equality. The reason why that's precisely important in this instance is because any other form of reparation would be totally incommensurable to the kind of harm inflicted upon these people. So you may apologize or you may give them more funding, which we suspect is what those guys are going to stand for, but that will never systematically count for the kind of harms that we visited upon those. What are precisely the harms that the United States government has systematically inflicted on African Americans, and why does that necessarily require statehood as the measure and the mechanism of reparation? Three things that we did. First, we denied them nationhood, and most directly, we denied them nationhood. The black population of the United States begins on a fundamental act of displacement. That is to say, white people going into Africa and rounding people onto ships, taking them out of nations that they had already belonged to, that nations they could otherwise freely move out of. So it comes from displacement and it comes from a refusal to allow people to immigrate. You couldn't, as a black slave, move out of your state, let alone out of your country. The denial of that ability to choose your nation for yourself is something that requires direct redress in the form of statehood. The second thing that we did to African Americans is we disenfranchised them. That is to say, your democratic right to be heard, to be counted as a citizen among equals in a polis. That requires directly an engagement with a state that gives you precisely that democratic right. We think that enhancement of citizenship is something that's required. The third harm visited upon African Americans is plunder. We say that the harm of U.S. government policy isn't just that they did negative policies, but rather that they stole money from African Americans. How did they do this? First, they tax them without giving them any representation. If you tax people with the promise that you'll get equal opportunities in education and health, but don't provide any of those things, we say that that is theft. When you lock up individuals unjustly and deprive them of their productive capacity to work or to earn a living wage for themselves, that too is theft. We say that those three things require, in principle, statehood. The importance of this argument is that it's not premised on any hypothetical successes or failures of that future state. That is to say, it's in those people's right to exercise for themselves and to form a system of government that they think will work for them. Just the way we don't deny any citizens the right to a nation just because we don't think it'll work out for them, we think here the principle of reparations makes it a requirement. Second, this makes it better for African Americans. We're going to explain why the comparative they need to defend on their side is delayed reform and in many instances no reform at all. The reason why that's the case is because African Americans have limited democratic representation in the United States as it presently stands. This is for a host of reasons. It's for zoning laws and gerrymandering, which have almost irreversibly meant that black people are put into smaller ghettos rather than having a bigger say in broader electorates. It's for a history of disenfranchisement, which means that African Americans are systemically less likely to turn out and to exercise their right to vote. It's because of the control of the media and organizations like Fox, and more importantly local media, which is disproportionately owned by white people. It's because of schooling and the ability to find education which directly correlates with you understanding voting issues and being able to turn out the vote, and the systemic failures of schools in African American districts. And lastly, it's for the existence of a two-party system where the Democrats can by and large count on African American votes and assume that because they don't have Donald Trump on their side, you're going to be able to get their votes. We think that democratic representation is better. Closing, I'll take you if you have anything. Yeah.
Why don't politicians in the Democratic Party have an incentive to cater to African American interests, if anything, to ensure turnout, which you say doesn't happen in this country?
Because they won't vote Republican. Two things. The second thing I'm going to talk about is what kind of change this leads to. The first thing that it does is that it gives them more money. Where does that money come from? First, it comes from resources that they get by controlling oil mines, and we're happy to give them, like if we do shale in Alaska, for instance, we're happy to give them a cut of that as well. The reason why that money and those resources rents don't currently get to African Americans is because of really low tax rates, which means that it goes into the pockets of executives at Enron rather than into African American communities. Second, internally, it means that African Americans for the first time have jobs on all different levels of the corporate structure. That's to say, you're not just a low-level employee, which can happen presently, but you're middle management and upper management as well. The third thing is, within this state, you don't have to do silly things that the US system does at the moment, like spending a vast amount of their GDP on military, for instance, or on farm subsidies for white farmers in Iowa. We think that makes them do those things. That kind of money is going to go towards productive things like the education and healthcare system, which for far too long has been disenfranchised. We think it allows them to escape from a police state that's been oppressing them. Reparations is a principal requirement. Statehood is the only way to deliver on that promise. We're very proud to propose.
Members of the panel, there is a structural tension on the government bench which I hope Finelli will address in the next speech. It is as follows. On the one hand, they tell you that the United States is so structurally racist, that the deck is so stacked against African Americans, that it is impossible for them to get a fair shake within the next 50 years. On the other hand, they trust the United States to do a great job with one of the hardest the hardest projects that exist, that is to say, setting up a new state, right? We would posit to you on side opposition that it is going to be, one, on a principled level, very difficult to do this without violating individual rights. Secondly, we would posit to you, in practice, just enormously difficult to create a functioning state for African Americans, even in Texas. And thirdly, that when the individuals who are left in the United States will get screwed over on their side of the house. Before I go into that, two pieces of extraneous rebuttal. Firstly, Beau proposes that a principle of reparation exists that requires us to compensate African Americans for the harm that was imposed upon them. We would posit that this is contingent on the project that we allow actually be something that is a workable and reasonable alternative, right? If individuals are actually harmed on balance by the kind of thing that is provided to them as reparations, it isn't actually reparations or compensation at all. The response that we get to this preempted from Beau is that in this case, this is the only kind of thing that is applicable because it's the only kind of thing that approximates a state that exists. The problem is this argument doesn't fly with the fact that unless we can provide a functioning state that provides reasonable prospects for advancement and so on, presumably this isn't actually meaningful compensation, right? If it's the case that the only alternatives that we provide someone are a failed state that isn't the actual meaningful comparative for these individuals, or alternatively make life worse for them in the United States, as I'll get to in constructive material, this won't fly. The second thing that everything else will be integrated. 2 points in substantive. The first is that this is going to be enormously difficult just as a technical matter to do while creating a functioning state. Why is this the case? 3 broad reasons. First, the mechanics of this are just enormously difficult. There are going to be a lot of Texans who aren't keen on moving out of Texas, right? One of 3 things happens on their side of the house. Firstly, you force them out at gunpoint. Texans love their guns. This is going to be kind of tough. Secondly, we would posit, you provide people vast amounts of compensation that is available voluntarily. If this is the case, though, and this is something else that's going to directly engage with, we would posit that it would be better to just directly give this compensation as reparations and so on, right? Broadly on a principled level, as Bo correctly points out, we're totally cool with expending all of the resources for the mechanical material to lead, get these people out. Whatever the fiat investment that they make, we fiat give that to reparations instead. Secondly, under this point, the second option that exists is to, just require these people to stay or allow them the option to stay. This entails massive governance problems, right, though? Because if it's truly the case that the entrenched networks of power that they tell you are so important will still remain, we would posit that it's the case that this isn't actually a meaningful opportunity for black individuals insofar as the old institutions will still remain. Thirdly, we would posit, and this is the most important problem in terms of forced population transfer and so on, just, you give people substantial incentives to leave. We just don't think that this is workable. They have to explain to you how you get all these people out. Go ahead.
Do you think that Israel is a functioning state? And if so, are many of these concerns mitigated by just the United States doing a proper job as we think it's in our right to fear?
So, a couple notes. First, Israel was founded, we would posit, after a really unique experience, not in the extent of oppression, but in the cut-off nature of it, right? We would posit there was an enormous incentive to leave Europe right at a particular moment. Secondly, though, we also think that, there is an argument to be made that the Israeli state took 30 or 40 years to rev up to its material, and this was a vast majority of support from a state, the United States, that was much more favorable to the Jewish people than, frankly, it is even right now to African Americans. So I don't think that that kind of support is analogous. Second thing that I want to talk about, though, is economic development, right? Because we would posit that it is very difficult for a black state to get off the ground for 2 reasons. First, there is an institutional track record that is required for lending and so on. The mere presence of resources, we would posit, will not be enough for the simple reason that to lend to individuals, you want to have a faith and assurance and so on, that they will get paid back. Even if there's an implicit government guarantee, as I'm sure that Finelli will explain to us, thank you. Even if there's an implicit government guarantee, we don't think that it's the case that this will be sufficient to allay investors' concerns, because the question will always be when that government guarantee is going to run out. The second problem in terms of this, though, is if you rely on a government essentially to misallocate resources, we would posit that these resources will be frequently misallocated, right? Simply giving a government just a lot of money to spit out creates situations like the resource curse, which we would posit implicate the government in not being able to effectively control spending and so on. What this means is that even if a state exists on their side of the house, unless they literally engage in wholesale confiscation of everything in the state of Texas, it's going to be very difficult to create a prosperous economy on their side. Second question, though, no thank you. What does this do to the United States? 3 broad layers, because first of all, we would posit many individuals won't be able to leave. Firstly, very wealthy black individuals are probably not going to be inclined to leave, insofar as they do have a level of comfort and so on in the United States that they don't want to give up. Secondly, though, we would posit very poor black individuals are highly unlikely to leave, one, because they may not have the physical resources to go to the new state, but secondly, because we would posit, even if it's the case that they can be provided these resources by the government or what have you, these social ties and so on that they have will punctually prevent them from leaving, because it won't be interesting to go into a new state if you don't feel that you'll be able to support yourself and so on there. What this means is that if we can demonstrate that the poorest individuals in the United States are made worse off on their side of the house, their own arguments ought to suggest that it's the case. Why is this the case? First, we think that we sap the energy that is needed for real change. We do think that the progress of racial justice in the United States over the last 200 years has been broadly positive. The response we get from this from Bo is that it's not the case that Democrats have an incentive to ensure turnout and so on, because they know that black individuals will always vote for them. The problem, as Ani explains, is that they don't know whether or not they will vote, period. And in an American election, unlike an Australian one, for example, where turnout is compulsory, it's just the case that you have to worry about the individuals who show up to the polls in the first place. This is the incentive, and this is why the Democratic Party in the status quo is very interested in making black voters believe that it is in their interests. Secondly, though, I think that contact between different individuals is important. I do believe that when I have a black individual in my history class, for example, I gain a particular perspective on U.S. history that I might not otherwise have. When I'm sympathetic to this individual, it makes me more likely to push for real change at the ballot box. We would posit that on their side of the House, you don't have that kind of activity. This is a serious problem, sapping the energy needed for change. Mr. Speaker, this is frankly a stupid idea we are very proud to oppose.
Oh, sorry. Got a fair bit to say. Panel, let it not be lost on you just how dire the situation for African Americans is within that prison they have to call their country under the state of affairs. The response to the principal argument was feeble and unacceptable for this debate. To suggest that there was a chronological distinction between what happened for the Jewish people in Israel and what's going on now flies in the face of the fact that 40% of African Americans are likely to get expelled or suspended from school before they graduate high school. 6 times the rate of imprisonment within that country is African Americans. In a country which has 25% of the world's imprisoned, that's 2.2 million people, right? 12-year-old Tamir Rice, Eric Gardner, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, gunned down by the protection of the state. These guys want them to call their own. It is laughable that that was the extension to the principal argument. 2 things in this speech. 1, the principle in this debate and why that fickle response was inadequate. The second thing is I'm going to talk about the benefits to African Americans. I'm going to talk 2 things. I'm going to do 2 things principally. 1, I'm going to add some material under why imprisonment in particular is so problematic for that population. And secondly, I'm going to respond to the material in opening opposition. Bo gave you 4 very sophisticated pieces of material about the principle in this debate because we think that is where this debate ought to be. What did we hear from opening opposition? It was a claim that this was a contingent argument. Do you see how ahistorical and morally bankrupt that response is? It's like I come to you and I steal your shoe and I say I'm not going to give it back to you because it's not good for you. It's patronizing and we think it's problematic in today's debate. First thing, the proportionality necessitates that this is the sort of response that these people were taking. They were literally forcibly extracted from their countries. These guys say the Texans are going to have a problem with those individuals. Ask the Africans 400 years ago how they felt about being taken away from their home. It's not a thing that they had the ability to say, oh no, well, let's deliberate what's the best way to set up the state technically, because all of their problems were mechanistic and none of them spoke to the heart of this debate. Secondly, Bo told you why these people aren't enfranchised, and finally he spoke to you about plunder. I'm going to ask you to reconcile what that plunder meant in this debate. It was 200 years of free labor, effectively slavery. If you evaluate minimum wage and you multiply it by the extent to which that is, we think it's worth infinitely more than the amount of resources we're giving these individuals. There's a principle here, Joe and Vinu, that you guys need to respond to. Okay, the benefits to African Americans. First thing, why reform is really not an option in today's debate. Bo gave you 5 pieces of material to speak to why reform can't happen. All they wanted to respond to was the argument about alienation from the state. What were those 5 pieces of material? Firstly, he told you zoning is impossible to work because of gerrymandering within the United States. Secondly, he told you about the fact that these people are alienated. Thirdly, he told you the fact of the matter is for African Americans to achieve any enfranchisement in that country, you need moderate white individuals to vote alongside them for policies that benefit those individuals. They don't do that under the current state of affairs because the media is owned by white interests that benefit from the continued subjugation of those individuals. CF Rush Limbaugh. The 4th thing Bo told you is the schooling system in America. I told you why. Almost half of them are bound to get suspended or expelled. But secondly, and over and above this, the fact of the matter is schooling is based on property taxes in the United States, and the fact that these people live in the most the poorest areas, it makes it less likely that they'll ever get adequate schooling. The 5th thing he told you was a party system that has no reason to respond to these people. These are the systemic problems you guys need to respond to. The sixth thing I'm going to add is the fact of the matter is that Citizens United passing within that country meant that African Americans can never get representation because the moneyed interests have adequate representation there. Well, I think that's the first thing our government is going to pass, like a constitutional requirement that you cap the amount of money people put in. What did they say in response to our material? One, why don't they vote for Democrats? He didn't respond to the sophistication of Bo's material to suggest never will these people vote for Republicans because that party is actively racist. It's captive demand that you need to deal with. But the second thing is these people have been alienated from the state. So if you look at voter turnout numbers within the United States, it's somewhere in a given year between 50 and 60%. If you look at the voter turnout for African Americans with the plausible exclusion of 2008, that number is about half that, right? So that's what these guys need to defend on their side of the house. Okay, what did we hear from the previous speaker by way of talking about this material? Firstly, he told you that we need to demonstrate that compensation and forcible removal can work. One, we think it worked in Israel. I mean, the questions about the moral status of the two states here, we think ours is especially justified. Secondly, it worked in South Sudan, for goodness sake, a country that was plunged in civil war for 20 years. We think the American government can do so pretty well in this particular instance. Then they had some, frankly, nonsensical arguments, which are just from the fact that these guys worked at a bank for summer. One, you need a track record of borrowing to be able to do your job well. We say a number of things to this response. Firstly, ExxonMobil continues to exist on our side of the house. We just tax them at a rate of 40%. We think we do so very well. The question of credit liability is not a sensible one. Second thing we suggest that we put credible campaign reform laws within this situation. They talked about misallocation of resources, and literally, panel, they gave you the tag of the resource curse but didn't give you an argument. The fact of the matter is the Democratic Republic of Congo is divided along ethnicity, which exacerbates the extent to which those things are problematic. These people are enfranchised because the state is based on their racial identity in a way that we think is justified. The final thing is they said people won't leave the United States. This is absolutely laughable. We think African Americans of all sorts feel the daily oppression that this country represents for them. Why do we change the prison system, and why that's incredibly beneficial in this debate? First thing, what is it to be imprisoned in America, and why does it damn people to life of subjugation? Before that, closing.
Oh yeah, sure. Your whole point about zoning in the United States and how difficult it is to fix is a little strange, given that you are rezoning literally the entire state of Texas. We can fix things in America.
Okay, the fact of the matter is twofold. Firstly, we told you the ability to change that is contingent on political interest, that we, given the existence of campaign finance, is incredibly unlikely to exist. But secondly, 20, 30 years down the line, what do you think it will look like once we implement closing opposition's campaign reform? Prisons, why is it bad? Four sorts of things. Firstly, you can't be employed because a lot of these things are publicly available that you were actively in prison. Secondly, ex-cons are excluded from existing in certain areas by laws that have been enshrined in the by constitutional interpretation. Third, you fall into gang violence that creates problems for these individuals. Fourth, they have 100,000 African Americans in solitary confinement. Those people leave with mental ailments that means they can't integrate into society. Why can't you change that on your side of the house? Firstly, private prisons. The moneyed interest there invest hundreds of billions of dollars. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but billions of dollars in lobbying the government to ensure that these things continue to exist. Secondly, the argument I gave you about education, and crucially, none of these change without us changing the view of moderates. Pan, I'm going to end with this. It is incredibly important that you not lose sight of the principle in this debate. These people are owed a right, and we're incredibly proud to propose because of it.
Members of this panel, it's true that there are problems in the United States. The question is whether or not you use all of the political will that side proposition wants to use in this round to set up an independent state, or rather have certain reforms within the United States to achieve all of the benefits and solve the harms that Finelli talks about. When he talks about things like prison reform, there are easy solutions to this. Things like repeal racist drug laws, things like ban private prisons, things, for example, like ensure that employers can't discriminate on the basis of criminal history. The comparative in this debate, given the fact that we established that we're fine giving direct cash transfers to African Americans, is which form of reparation is preferable. It is not sufficient to merely claim that we have harmed individuals in the past. The question is whether or not giving a state itself is the best way of repairing those harms that have been elicited upon African Americans. That is the question in this debate. First then, on the principle. So all of their arguments here are about how in certain cases we've harmed African Americans. That's true. But if their policy makes each and every African American worse off under the guise of helping them, that is unacceptable, and that is what this debate is about. First question, what happens in the transitionary period? It is funny, because the one time the United States tried this was in the 1920s with Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement in the formation of the state of Liberia, and it failed miserably. It is not sufficient to merely wave a magic wand and claim the United States is good at fixing states when empirically it has failed. Why is it the case that it will structurally fail here? First, we believe that in general there is literally no investment that will happen in this state. It is not sufficient to merely have 5 years of the US government providing it resources when you need private firms that are going in, that are willing to hire individuals. That simply won't happen on their side. Second, though, we believe in general there are huge differences in degree to the backlash that's created when you forcibly remove individuals from their houses. That, we say, makes it far less likely that individuals are willing to interact with and view African Americans in the same way. It hurts people who moved to the state and those who are at home. Let's take the best case scenario for them. Say you do get the state off the ground, right? This is the best case scenario for them. 5 sorts of things here in terms of why there are substantial harms. The first is in general you cause substantial disenfranchisement on 2 levels. The first is you cause substantial disenfranchisement and harms towards Hispanic Americans in the United States. Why is this the case? Because in the status quo, the largest political coalition voting bloc for individuals, for example, of other immigrant communities are often African Americans. If you buy all of their arguments and you have a substantial number of African Americans leaving, it becomes far less likely for in general, Latinos in general to get these sort of political reforms when they are equally harmed by all of the policies that Beau and Finale talk about. Why is this important? Because we believe all of their arguments about historical harm apply equally, if not better, in the case of Hispanic Americans. The policies the United States has towards drug laws, for example, have caused people from El Salvador to flee in droves to the United States only to be disenfranchised because they're labeled as undocumented immigrants. That is unacceptable. When it's the case that you remove the largest voting bloc that votes with Latinos in the United States, it becomes far less likely to get structural reform. On a weighing level, we believe that is far more important because the individuals who are harmed, individual Latinos who are harmed in general, are far closer temporally to the actual policies of the United States than that of slavery and so on. But second and more importantly, though, blacks, for example, in the new state of Texas itself that's created are also harmed. Just as how Arab Israelis in the status quo are substantially discriminated and aren't given political rights, we believe those individuals are also harmed. But finally, though, we believe a number of African Americans in general simply won't move. And this, by the way, is a crucial question in this debate. It is not sufficient for side proposition to merely say, they will move because they want to do so. Look, there are a substantial number of resources you need to be able to move. 1, you often need to have a stable job, right? There are individuals, for example, who are suffering in Africa right now, and they can't just pick up a briefcase and move. It is laughable to claim that will happen. Second, in general, there's often sentimental value surrounding black culture in many areas which cause these individuals not to move. The ramification of this argument is that if it's the case that only middle-class black individuals are actually able to move. Why is this important? First of all, it removes literally any political voice for the poorest African Americans in the status quo. These are the individuals who are most harmed by the disparate policies of the US government, and they have no political voice on their side. When Finale talks about Citizens United, that is exactly our argument. When you take away the subsection of the African American body that has any ability to voice political discourse, that is unacceptable. Second, though, I'll take closing actually.
The poorest African Americans in America suffer the worst discrimination in terms of education and in terms of policing. What incentive do they have not to move?
They don't. And 1, they often aren't going to be able to find jobs in this new area, right? It's not sufficient to wave a magic wand and say, a new state exists. 2, there are often large amounts of resources you need to move, right? It's not the case you can simply just move to another state and hope you'll be able to set a family there. 3, they often have ties in general to their community. Maybe the education system is screwed up, but in general, when you don't have the ability to have institutional areas in the new state itself, that, we say, is what causes that. Second, though, economic deprivation in general. We believe that in general, to the extent that I've already talked about this, we don't believe you get the long-term economic development that's necessary for growth. When it's the case that you have primarily resources running the state itself, it becomes much, much harder to get the sort of growth you talk about. First of all, in general, to growth you talk about. Third, though, we believe that in general, it leads to large amounts of nationalism within the United States itself. What you do on their side is you vindicate the white supremacist movement, which has literally been saying this is not a place for African Americans. That is what you do on their side of the house. Why is that important? Because it means that the kinds of groups in general that aren't benefited by that policy are harmed even worse. These are immigrant communities that are also harmed. That we say is worse. It vindicates exclusion narratives, that what it means to be an American is to be white, and that we say is unacceptable. Building a state about ethnicity and ethnicity alone leads to disasters, and that is what they create. Finally, though, we believe that in general, a direct cash transfer in the form is a preferable form of reparations. And here's where the entirety of government bench misses the comparative. We believe that in general, on our side, we uniquely help the poorest African American individuals who aren't going to be able to uproot their entire lives. They're more likely to be able to spend in local areas boosting consumption. They're more likely to be able to spend that money and to be able to in general enroll their kids in private institutions. That we say is beneficial. That is comparatively beneficial to all of their analysis because it helps the individuals who are the most harmed in general. But fifth and finally, though, it splinters the African American movement itself because there will be certain wealthy black individuals who simply won't move at all, right? Why is this a problem? Because now those individuals are targeted as being people who don't support black rights. When you splinter away the entire black movement, taking away the people who have the most amount of resources, when people like Lawrence Otis Graham are labeled as being anti-black because they continue to want to work at their Manhattan law firm, that we say makes it much less likely to get the political reform that these guys talk about. That means the kind of individuals that these guys want to benefit aren't benefited, and rather harms are imposed upon individuals in a disparate way. It's rebuttal then that to opening government that simply hasn't been covered already. So they talk about principles in general. Once again, this is completely contingent and pragmatics. It is not sufficient to merely claim we've harmed African Americans in the past. The question is whether a form of cash transfer is a preferable form of reparation to all others, right? It's not the case that we're sitting here and just saying cross our thumbs and hope nothing happens. They talk about how in general there's no political will to do this in status quo. I explain that in general, the Democratic Party has an incentive to ensure that African Americans show up. Yes, they're afraid that Donald Trump will get votes. The way you counterbalance that is to get your own coalition to show up. That's what we get on our side. So proud to oppose.
Honorable panel, closing government is going to try to do two things in our case. Firstly, we're going to show you why giving African Americans a state is the most appropriate form of reparation as given the old challenge. And secondly, we'll deal with all the nitty-gritty mechanics and paint for you a substantive picture of how we think this state could succeed. We'll have rebuttal at the end. So I'm going to give you 2 points in extension. Why, firstly, we're going to deepen upon the historical context that opening government gives you and show you why the current context is currently getting worse. And we're going to show you why, in principle, giving African Americans a state is the best way forward. And secondly, we're going to deal with the practical arguments. We're going to paint a picture of how they succeed. So first, why do we think racism is currently getting worse? And this is a problem that cannot be solved by political will. So just empirically speaking, if you look at what's going on, the top Republican candidate for president, Donald Trump, gains a 5% boost in rating polls every time he says a racist thing, right? This literally means that probably like at least 20% of the country is explicitly racist and would not be part of any transition or any plan to change. But secondly, we say that even if opposition would like to hang their head on like very young people, right? If you look at what happened in the state of Missouri, where like a group of African Americans literally just said, you really shouldn't be racist to us. What they got from 18-year-olds in the state of Missouri is that if you continue telling us we should treat you equally, we are going to shoot you. If the 18-year-olds in your country are not going to treat you fairly, if the government, as they tell you with a lot of political will, the government has been dealing with this problem for the last 50 years, till date, we've not had progress. We're not sure what is the mechanism for change. But secondly, on a very pragmatic level, we tell you that African Americans have performed poorly, and actually the gap between them and white people have increased in a few areas. Firstly, we tell you the gap in real median income has increased by 5,000, such that the average black family makes 30K, whereas the average white family makes 55K. This is a gap that has increased, and we don't show no sign of decreasing. We tell you that segregation has actually increased, which means that people get even worse educational outcomes. So, right. But thirdly, we tell you that the poverty trap continues to grip them, right? Where like in any race-neutral state, where if you have fewer resources, you are always going to be left behind. But what are the real structural barriers to change that side opposition can never overcome? The not in my backyard mentality, right? If you ask people, do you think that black people, do you think they deserve equal education? People will answer yes. And then when you ask them, do you want to take money out of your school district to give it to us? They will say no, right? So we don't think this is the change that you can ever overcome on any basis, and that is why we think the new state is the best way to do this. But let's say, even if we believe them, that with infinite political will, they can actually effect some change 100 years from now. We think that the suffering we portray to you is so unjust that you need to do whatever you can right now, right? Where you literally have thousands of people being locked up innocently, where a black person, given the same set of facts, has a 10 times higher chance of being convicted in a legal system than a white person. We tell you that even if we wait for 100 years, the costs are too high, that you cannot just afford to not do anything. But opening opposition asks, but why is giving them a state the best way forward? So we're going to give you a principal argument here, independent of any of our practical argument. We tell you that the defining characteristic of people is a capacity for autonomy, right? We respect humanities insofar as they can make their own decisions. They themselves can choose what to value. We tell you that any preferences expressed by the African American community, even if every one of them turn out to vote, will never be turned into policy, right? As opening tells you. But secondly, though, we think the really important principle here at stake is that if you recognize the right to self-determination, if you believe that people who see themselves as different or are being treated unfairly by a system deserves their own state to express themselves, if you support movements like Palestine and Tibetan independence, then you must also necessarily support this movement, right? Recognize that a lot of African Americans believe that they have a different history, they have a different culture that can never be sufficiently expressed in a white majority America. So that is why we think this is the best policy. But what about the pragmatics, right? So Anirudh is really concerned that they're not going to get a lot of investment. So we tell you why do we think they're going to get more economic opportunities? So firstly, we tell you that capital is relative, right? So if you have no track record yet, like in the worst case scenario, if you offer a substantially high return, capital will still flow in, right? So it's not as if it's going to be zero capital flowing in. But what else do you get as an independent state? We tell you that as an independent state, you get financial assistance from institutions like the World Bank, right? Who is directly able to fund your development in a way you gain funds that you can never otherwise have. But what we think is really, really important that you get as an independent state is that the financial numbers that come out from your country accurately reflect the truth on the floor, right? We tell you a lot of people in America would actively deny that black poverty is a real thing, right? We tell you that statistics get muddled away when they are in the average. We tell you that this allows you to see the problems for themselves and target actions. Sure.
When white individuals who are squishy moderates in the status quo can point to the failure of a black state and say it's because they didn't work hard enough, what do you do to solve that problem?
Okay, as we explained to you, those people exist on either side. They are already doing so much harm that our policy at least allows people to get away from them, right? But if you let me continue my argumentation, I'm going to show you why people can succeed. So recognize that recognize that structural and economic barriers are not the only things holding African Americans back, right? We tell you that they have internalized their oppression and we think that they cannot succeed in modern America. Why is it going to be different in a new state? Firstly, we tell you they don't have to define themselves relative to outsiders, right? They don't have to judge themselves by white standards of success. But secondly, we tell you that people don't get discriminated against from a young age. They don't get told that black people are different, right? They don't see, like, for instance, black people not inheriting the tech industry, because presumably they are also going to have a tech industry where there's going to be African Americans there, right? They're going to see people successful up and down the business ladder, and here is the difference. In current America, we tell you there's often a narrative that someone is there potentially because they benefited from affirmative action. In the new state, when people succeed, it is truly because of their own ability. When that happens, there is no denial. We give you economic factors of investment. We change the cultural dialogue. We think these people have the right to self-determination. That is why the state is the only way forward.
Honorable Speaker, the way to fix race relations in the United States is not to permanently enshrine racial divides in bordering countries, is not to poke the bear of racist Americans in the United States and give them a government-justified rhetoric to further their abuse, and is not to disenfranchise African Americans from all of the levers of economic, and political, and social powers in the United States, which will have a huge influence over their life whether they move or not. We are very proud to oppose. The first thing that I want to do in extension is talk about the principle, because this is what side government bases their case on, particularly First Gov. The principle is all well and good, but doesn't matter if the impacts are bad. Firstly, I am not aware of a large vocal African American group in the United States pushing for independent statehood, right? Like, I am not clear or convinced that this is what the black people of America want. So saying that because they were removed from their home centuries ago, which was terrible, means that the people now want to have a state does not follow. Secondly, principally, the United States government has an obligation to black citizens of the United States today who have formed businesses, communities, and lives in the United States. It has a duty to them, principally, to make their lives better. So if we can show you that that does not happen, then we win the principle. Okay, now let's talk about why this will make America substantially more racist. The first point on this, which is the most obvious, is you now take millions of Texans who are already the most racist in America, you remove them, to Texans. There are problems in race relations in the southern United States, is my claim. So you exacerbate, it might be contentious. You exacerbate these tensions by taking these people who on average tend to hold more discriminatory views, wealthy people with oil money, and you put them into the general population of the United States, right? I have a suspicion that they are going to use their social and economic influence in a bad way for African Americans, in this new state. Secondly, you tell racists in the United States that black people do not belong in the United States, right? The people who remain in the United States will almost certainly suffer from on-the-ground discrimination in terms of having their property vandalized, in terms of having shop fronts destroyed or graffitied, in terms of being catcalled, or in the worst case, abused on the street because you incite the fire of race relations in the United States. This is harmful and creates a racist America. No thank you. Why is it bad to have a racist America? There are two reasons. Because either this forces black people to leave and move to the state. Why is this bad? Because they have community ties. They have lived in neighborhoods for generations. They have relationships with their neighbors. They have very strong communities that provide support, economic support, social support, religious support. They are forced out of their home by a government policy that says you do not belong here. That is extremely harmful for the people who are forced to leave their homes. Secondly, it's harmful for the people who stayed because they face a greater racist America. Why is it worse? Because black people in America now have significantly less political representation, right? There are no black blocks of voters in the United States anymore because they have moved to a different state. So the voice of the black population in the United States, who are currently making great inroads in police accountability, no longer have the domestic political power for politicians to talk to. If they think it's bad currently for black people to have political representation in the United States, how do you think it's going to be if a significant portion of them leave, right? Like, the democratic accountability is completely gone. Okay, now let's talk about why it's bad to force black people out of America. Because America has considerably great things in it that black people are disenfranchised from. Firstly, New York City, right? Like the financial capital of the world. It is important, I think, for black people to be able to live there comfortably and develop their careers and develop substantial capital resources. What about Los Angeles, the entertainment capital of the world? What about incredible educational institutions such as Harvard, Columbia, Princeton, right? Like, we want black people to be able to access the incredibly important benefits of the United States. They are less likely to if it is a hostile environment for them in the United States. This is bad because then we don't get powerful black advocates coming out of these institutions. We do not get powerful black investment bankers or lawyers or politicians because they are blocked from entering the state. Yes, front half.
Diaspora populations of this new nation face racism in New York and Los Angeles where they go to work. They're now protected by international law as a member of a new state in a way that you don't get when you're accountable to domestic law.
Your whole point is that they're not protected by real domestic law, right? With police, right? Like, which do you think is a better mechanism? Like, I am more happy to be protected by domestic law than international law, which nobody really follows, right? Like, if your whole point is that currently in the racial America that hasn't been destroyed by this conflict, that black people are abused by police, I don't think that some international convention is going to stop a Texan who's been removed from his generational familial home from acting against racial minority in a violent manner. That is a ridiculous claim. Okay, next, let's talk about the alternatives, right? We want a world in which racism is combated in the United States, where black people can stay in their homes, access the centers of political and economic capital that are important to them. How do we do this? Firstly, political power. So firstly, I've given you an example of the comparative on political power, right? The one comparative is where you take black people out of the voter base completely. That is obviously substantially worse. Secondly, we think that side government mischaracterizes the political power of blacks in the United States right now, of black people in the United States right now. Voter turnout, as Finelli said, was much better in 2008. Why do you think that is? Because the black community and movement is mobilizing themselves politically and increasing their political power, right? This is something that will continue to happen and can continue to happen. Secondly, social justice movements like Black Lives Matter are incredibly valuable and persuasive to moderates. There are millions of powerful majority members in the United States who feel sympathy for Trayvon Martin, who feel sympathy for black people who are systematically abused by the state, and many of them are in this room and contain substantial influence economically and socially and politically. It's very difficult to say that black people are systematically removed from the echelons of power when the president is black, right? Like, I mean, I don't want to just be like, oh, all problems are gone now, but clearly there's an increasing political power of this group, right? You don't want to completely destroy that. Next, the economic power of black people in the United States is increasing as they generate wealth, right? By moving them away, it will be so bad. Let's talk about the responses here. We get a few claims from side First Gov that we can't fix things, right? They say zoning and gerrymandering is bad. If you're rezoning all of Texas, you can rezone a few districts in the United States. They say you can't access moderate voters. This is just not true, right? People care about other people, particularly those that are disenfranchised by the state. And we've seen great, powerful changes in the United States to keeping police accountable, right? There have been officers charged and convicted of murder, which has never happened before, right? This shows a clear demonstration of the power of these social justice movements. We want an America where black people face equality and where they can access the homes and futures that they deserve. We are very proud to oppose.
Yeah.
Thank you, honorable panel. I think all of side opposition misses the point of this debate. The point of this debate is not an economics debate of whether the state can succeed, but whether the United States has an obligation, because of the subjugation of black bodies that it has done, to give these people statehood. I don't think we get responses to most of the strongest of our material, and this is going to be very, very important. But first, I'm going to have 2 points of crystallization, self-actualization, and then pragmatics. But I'm also going to talk about why the characterization of what we get out of race relations from the last speech is simply incorrect. As Larry tells you, with actual statistics rather than absurd claims and a reference to the sitting president, race relations are not getting better in this country. Even if African Americans have more political power, they have a huge barrier that they will never actually have the political power that they deserve. Namely, they make up less than 13% of the population and will always be dependent upon the very white people who subjugate them to get effectual policy change in the United States. They do not give us any metric. We identify in an opening and closing why there are structural problems that will stop, even with political will, these problems from happening. Their response is literally, if we can redistrict Texas, we can redistrict anywhere. This is a lie. The reason is, if you go to where I live in East Tennessee, no one is going to want to put black people, or funding rather, to black people's schools. No one is going to give more funding to Memphis because the rich white assholes in Memphis don't want these people to take away from their own funding. That is sadly the way the world works. So, why does self-actualization mean that these people deserve a state? I've already talked about why these people are in the status quo, dependent upon the white people who subjugate them, but there's more to it than that. I think the best-ish response we hear from this is that the United States has a duty to help these people. Yes, they have for the past 400 years, 300 years. They haven't done so. They are already failing them. The alternative, however, that we provide may not be perfect, but it is much better than the status quo. Yes, it is sad that black people cannot live safely in New York, but that is unfortunately the reality on both sides of the house. Unfortunately, black people are gunned down all across this country, specifically in New York. We may actually give them a place to escape this. Yes, maybe not everyone will leave, right? We at least have a system in which you can escape the actual subjugation that these people are facing. But moreover, we actually tell you that these people can still come to New York. Granted, my partner is an immigrant in New York. We think this is ridiculous. But further, I do think the response we hear from opening is quite good, that they will have international protection. But further we tell you, and coming out of the last speech I think this is particularly important, something they never grappled with, that even if they get away in this round of conceding the principle that these people deserve a state, and then somehow winning on vague pragmatic harms, there are more to pragmatics than just whether it will be economically successful. We tell you that these people are barred from accessing an independent culture. This is hugely important. As we tell you, the things that make people are things like your ability to interact with the polity and affect political change. And further, your ability to have a distinct culture. This never happens in the status quo of the United States. Look to places like Chicago and Memphis, where black cultural museums actually have rich white men sitting on the board of directors and are struggling financially. These people cannot have an independent culture when the strings of the purse are controlled by the white people who have a vested interest in keeping them down and subjugated. I'll take opening.
When Latino Americans, who have also been disenfranchised, oppressed, and are imprisoned at 7 times the rate of white Americans, lack political power because the primary voting bloc with which they coalition flees the coop, as you say, do you do justice to those individuals who deserve it?
Look, yes, it sucks to be Hispanic in America too. We don't have to fix everything. We don't think we could be expected to simply hold up the rights of every single minority group in this debate. We think that all of the arguments we give about that you give about why these people would be represented anyway is fundamentally a knife in your own case, right? If this Democratic Party has a good structural reason to represent blacks, why won't they do that to Hispanics? One, given that they're a larger minority group in the status quo, right? That's a huge contradiction. But further, we also tell you that we can defend other policy outcomes for Hispanics, right? Maybe we should give them a state too. Maybe Texas is better in the hands of them. Lots of issues here. We don't think that's ever going to be a reason to vote opposition in this round. Second issue, pragmatics. Why do we think black people are better off in Texas than they'll ever be in places like Louisiana or even, unfortunately, New York? We tell you that these people are actually going to have equal protection on our side of the house and equal education. What we think this means is you're not going to have the sort of structural problems I've already talked about keeping you from having an actual education. We think one of the most important issues here, and this is also going to impact culture, is that these people will no longer have to interact with racism so regularly that they internalize it as truth. This is sadly what happens to many African Americans in the United States, especially for the young. What happens is when you are told time and time again by the ruling race in your country that you are not equal, even if it is implicitly told to you, you start to internalize this and you expect different outcomes. We eliminate this on our side of the house. Larry tells you we create dominant images in which black people can work at all levels of corporations and in all types of jobs. This means that people will no longer expect less by virtue of being black. We think this does so much for the self-actualization and identity of African Americans that it cannot be overstated in this round. We are even willing to accept that perhaps the United States gets marginally more racist if you get better political outcomes for African Americans. But I think this is far overstated. Even if every racist asshole in Texas moved to Minnesota, I do not think Minnesota would suddenly start hating all black people. But further, I think that most of these people are not, or like even if they're politically upset, we're willing to bite that harm in response for actually providing for these people. On our side of the house, we create more economic opportunity because these people can actually practice policy that will help them. They're never able to do the best policy outcomes on their side of the house because they're unable to get over the largest voting bloc in the United States, rich white people, or middle-class white people, equally racist. What we do tell you, though, is that these people are now able to get better economic outcomes by virtue of them being a state, by virtue of them actually able to choose policy for themselves, and by virtue of having access and control over their own culture and identity. Very, very proud to propose.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to talk about three things in this speech. I want to talk about the principles that lie at the heart of it. I then want to talk about life in America and life in the new state. Let's begin with principles. The key contention here from the government side has been that the subjugation of black people within America was more specific than just taking away money. For them, the subjugation specifically involved removing them from a nation, or rather a collection of nations, and therefore, even if the new state is more poor, the only proper redress for them will be giving them a state. There are two main problems with this that Joe identifies. Opening opposition's contribution to this is largely to say that if the state is poorer, we win the principle debate, but there's two things Joe adds. First, he points to the lack of a strong will within the African American community for such a movement of nationhood, specifically in the modern day. Why does that lack of political will matter? Because in light of the massive coercive pressures that Joe describes that will now be applied to African Americans, they are repeating the very harm that they say 400 years ago was the source of our principled obligation today. They're in effect forcing African Americans to leave communities that they have finally formed strong attachments to and have set up homes in, have set up friends in, and set up communities in. In light of this, what they're doing is repeating the very harms they say lead to the problems they're trying to solve. I think the real question in this debate is to look at what is best for African Americans within America today and to address what will best suit their needs. And I think the fact that you're likely to repeat the harms that they're worried about is significant. The addition to the principal debate we get from the closing government is to talk about autonomy and why it's really important to autonomy to be able to embrace your own culture. But notably, the conception of culture they give you seems purely tied to having representation on museum boards. There's no acknowledgement of the massive amount of culture within African American communities that people are able to engage in that don't involve these kind of institutions. And even within these institutions, we believe that the changes you see in economic power within African American communities within the United States is likely to see a change in those types of ownership structures as well. Before I go on, I'll take from
Vinu, your only response to our claim that the only commensurate response for centuries of plunder, denial of statehood, and enfranchisement is that they haven't asked for it yet. How on earth is that consistent, the claim that they identify with the current state of the US, with the problems we've identified up and down?
Because I think it points to a very central fact. I think what most African Americans within America would actually want is for that state to improve without losing access to the massive benefits of that state that Joe has applied. Their problem is not with America, but discrimination within America. The fact that a new state is the solution to it is a link that hasn't been made by that side. Let's talk about life in America and then life in the new state. Before talking about life in America, I want to be very clear about one thing. This debate is not about the government side standing up and listing out a bunch of reasons why America is terrible to black people. If that was all they had to do to be successful, we could all have walked out 2 minutes into the PM speech, because no one is contesting that. They've missed the nuances about who leaves, who stays, and who actually experiences racism within that country. So no, thank you. Let's be very clear about one thing. When Joe talks to you about the massive coercive pressures that are applied to African American communities, the fact that their political capital within the state massively shrinks, their response to this has been, but it's already terrible within America, but things are already really bad for them. They never engage with the fact that many people in the state are structurally unable to leave. They also never engage with the fact, this is really important, that wealthy African Americans are unlikely to want to leave either. They've uniquely hurt the groups of people that they're concerned about and just say that they can improve things within this new state. I don't think they've actually engaged with how many people are able to move and the number of people left behind for whom things get much worse. Secondly, and what Joe tells you, for the people who leave, they are now unable to access one of the world's preeminent educational and financial sectors. That is going to be incredibly bad for the development of that state and for the development of people within that state. The response from closing government is that, well, my partner was able to attend this institution and he's an immigrant. But the problem is that he doesn't deal with how the situation and race relations in America would change if this policy was passed. It will become substantially harder for these people to attend institutions like Harvard, like Princeton, and to go to the financial sectors within the United States that are uniquely important to the state, both because America is generally a very strong economic power and because of its proximity to that country geographically. You massively deprive people in that state of their ability to advance as well. No, thank you. The final thing to note on their general claim that life in America is terrible for African Americans is they never engage with the comparative of what life will look in the new state. No, thank you. And that's something I want to move to in the third theme of this debate, because I think it's very, very important to understanding how their case actually breaks down. What we hear from opening opposition on life within the new state is that, in general, life within the new state will be poor, there will be a lack of investment into that country, and that's going to be incredibly problematic. What Joe and I stand on is the idea that the inability to access educational institutions and the inability to move into financial sectors hurts the long-term ability of that state to develop as well. No, thank you. There is no guarantee that the kind of state they're going to set up is one which is more politically inclusive than the one they're leaving. Fanelli directly says in his speech that this state will set up a constitutional amendment that will basically be the opposite of what Citizens United was. There is no reason to believe the state will do that. There is no reason to believe that in the conditions of poverty in which the state is likely to be initially formed, that the kind of political actors and the kind of political players who gain power will necessarily do things that are economically in the best interest of the vast majority of their population. The last thing to note in life in the new state is that the closing government tells us that in this state, no thank you, people are able to succeed because of their own ability. They don't have to live with the fact that anytime they succeed within, no thank you, within the United States, they are condemned as being the beneficiaries of affirmative action and are condemned as being, no thank you, people who genuinely earned their stock in life. There's a number of things to note here. The first one is he assumes that it is preferable to live in a state wherein your success is sometimes questioned, as opposed to a state where you are unable to gain access to the means of achieving that success in the first place. If it becomes meaningfully more difficult, as Joe tells you, for African Americans within this new state to access preeminent educational institutions, you are making an assumption on their behalf that the questioning that comes is worse than a lack of access to those institutions at all. And I think that's incredibly pernicious for their side of the house. The last thing to note about comparing life in America to life in the new state, and Joe talks about this. He says if you're able to rezone Texas, you can probably rezone many other things. But the important thing to take away from that is the amount of political capital they're going to have on their side of the house is something that can be used to reform a lot of the problems within America. The key question in this debate, then, is whether or not the question is what is better for the African American community as it is today and their demands. What most African Americans, we would contend, want is not to set up a new state, but to see conditions within America improved. At the point where you exert massive amounts of coercive pressure on people in that state to leave, you are likely to see people leaving communities they formed ties to, leaving friends they formed, and leaving a quality of life which we think is getting better and will continue to get better in the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Good job, man.